And so now we can move on to Parmin Rahimpoor-Marnani's presentation. She is entering her fourth year of her undergraduate studies in Kinesiology and Health Sciences at York University. She's particularly interested in the systemic and socioeconomic factors that impact the accessibility of healthcare services. Parmin is a volunteer with AIC's Sharpen the Quill program and a research assistant at 2 neuroscience laboratories at York University. In her free time, she enjoys reading and running. Here she is with her analysis on effectiveness of global rural teleoncology and future routes for teleoncology research in the context of Canadian rural areas, a narrative review of the literature. So you can take it away, Parmin.
So thank you everyone for joining me for this presentation during the AIC conference today. And as Jess explained, today we're going to be exploring the effectiveness of global rural teleoncology and the future routes for teleoncology research, specifically in the context of a Canadian rural area. But before that, I want to acknowledge that I will be your presenter for today's narrative review as we'll explore it. But I would like to send a huge thank you to Dr. Austin Martin, Jasrita Singh, Devat Baswar, David Was, as well as Vivek Kannan, who provided extreme support for me during the process of writing this narrative review. And so I just wanted to send a huge thank you at the very beginning. But in terms of the topics that we will explore today, we will get started with an introduction of what teleoncology is and why examining it a bit more is worth it. The goals of the narrative review that we explored, the materials and methods used, the results of our narrative review, a discussion portion, and this discussion portion is broken down to 2 sections, one of them being the significance of our results, and the second one provides future directions for rural teleoncology. Okay, so what is teleoncology? It is essentially any use of telemedicine in the context of cancer and oncology. And as many of us know already, it has been on the rise, especially over the past decade. Because of various reasons, but one of the biggest ones at the moment is that, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are really putting an effort into limiting in-person interactions, this could be a great platform for providing more online-based modes of care, and in order to ensure that we are maintaining the equity within our healthcare systems by providing rural communities who may be at a geographical, social, or health-based disadvantage with the healthcare that they need. So in this narrative review, our goal was to better understand the effectiveness of current teleoncology innovations across the world by assessing the advantages and disadvantages of teleoncology use compared to in-person modes of oncology, assessing the current teleoncology innovations and modes on a global level in order to see whether they are applicable to perhaps a Canadian rural context as well, and finally to suggest possible future research directions for teleoncology. So as our materials and methods, since this was a narrative review, we had to look through the current literature on the topic, but due to a lack of sufficient numbers of COVID-19 era research, and also a lack of sufficient numbers specifically in a rural context, we decided to expand our article search to countries beyond Canada and the G7 countries, as well as non-COVID-19 related contexts. So that means that we actually went all the way back until 2010 in order to find the articles that we evaluated for this narrative review. And essentially, the way the articles were found were through a keyword research on key article or article-based platforms such as Google Scholar, Journal of Clinical Oncology, ResearchGate, and the Journal of National Cancer Institute. Our criteria for selecting these articles was obviously the first one being that the article was originally written in English. We also had a specific keyword search that we used. The article had to be specific to teleoncology and not other modes of telemedicine. The article had to be specific again, and also the article had to be not older than 2010. And this is the Prisma diagram of what our article search looked like. So essentially, we started with 20 articles after duplications were removed, and after our progressive process of removing articles, we ended up with 14 articles that were used for this narrative review. In terms of the results, we found a variety of different advantages that teleoncology brings to our healthcare, including improved patient care because of the significant reduction in the frequencies of transportation and the time and financial savings that it brought to us. Effective solution for addressing patient and medical provider concerns with chances of contracting COVID-19 or getting infected with it during in-person interactions. Enhanced efficiency and of conducting trial eligibility assessments, increased support for patients through enhanced collaborations between various healthcare providers. One interesting finding was that it also made patients feel more comfortable with hearing bad news through teleoncology appointments. So, although you may think that in an online based scenario, there's not that, in-person support that a physician may provide, it was actually found that patients may actually feel more comfortable with, hearing bad news, perhaps, about the diagnosis of a cancer during online appointments. We also saw improved compliance in terms of drug administration and lifestyle changes, obviously because of the nature of following up with the patients being easier in an online context. And finally, reduced delays and waiting times in terms of treatment administration. However, obviously, we also saw the other side of the coin in terms of the disadvantages of teleoncology compared to in-person modes of healthcare, including significant reductions of inpatient volumes of many healthcare professionals compared to in-person ones, simply due to a lack of awareness of the availability of the services. We also found an unavailability of sufficient numbers of healthcare providers who actually have received that teleoncology training. And so because of that, this is something that really has to be explored within our current healthcare system. We also saw a lack of acceptance of teleoncology, again, due to that lack of in-person interaction with the patient. We saw a lack of clear guidelines in terms of healthcare workers' salary payments, which obviously could be a huge limiting factor in terms of, making sure that the healthcare providers are being paid for the service that they provide. We saw some conflicts over professional power in terms of patient consents. So this is an area that also has to be explored. And finally, we saw a lack of sufficient teleoncology and quiet rooms for teleoncology appointments to be hosted, especially in the context of rural areas. So although this is a great way to make healthcare more accessible, we also have to make sure that we're working on this accessibility at the rural areas themselves by making sure that we actually do have those teleoncology appointment rooms and devices that are required. In terms of the significance of the results, so you may be wondering, why is this significant? Obviously, one of the reasons is because teleoncology can really change the nature of our healthcare over the coming years, even after the pandemic, by reducing waiting times and conservation of huge deals of energy and money for both the patients and the healthcare providers. It helps with enhanced interdisciplinary collaborations between healthcare providers. And also, as mentioned previously, patients actually felt more comfortable regarding hearing bad news, which is a great sign. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that some of the benefits may in fact serve as a hurdle or disadvantage towards the quality of health. Some examples of it, could be increased likelihood of screen and work fatigue for healthcare workers. Obviously, with perhaps the expectations of patients in terms of more following up in an online context, that could really lead to work and screen fatigue for the healthcare workers, and also a lack of sufficient consistency in terms of teleoncology and telemedicine related billing regulations and payments. Could really serve as a limiting factor or something that really causes that enhanced fatigue among healthcare workers and enhanced dissatisfaction potentially. And in terms of the nature of the teleoncology itself, however, it's important to recognize that we also have a lot of underlying causes that lead to these disadvantages in rural contexts, including the less accessible geographical location of many rural areas, language and culture barriers that may still be present, specifically in the context of indigenous languages, histories of privilege, colonialism, and past unfair treatments for these communities, confidentiality issues, as well as patient autonomy issues. So, sometimes these data may be shared in ways that the patients are not necessarily made aware of. And as a result, it's important to make sure that patient autonomy is being maintained. And also, a need for teleoncology services still requires appropriately designed location and facilities, as mentioned earlier. So again, some take-home messages that we can gain from this in terms of ways that we can lead to the further expansion of teleoncology in a way that makes health truly equitable for everyone, is to make sure that we are providing that telehealth-related training to healthcare professionals at medical schools, at centers that train these healthcare professionals during their actual study period. We can also work on increasing knowledge dissemination to rural areas about the presence of these services in order to work on that, on enhancing that sense of trust. We should be working on enhancing the accessibility of teleoncology services to the areas, addressing the concerns about lack of physical examination concerns is also important, because many patients may be hesitant to these services simply because there is not a doctor actually doing the checkup for them. So we have to make sure that we're addressing that, this is still a strategy that works with evidence and proof. And we should also work on conducting more research in rural Canadian settings. So that was actually something that we discovered during the narrative review. It was, something that we noticed was simply that there wasn't sufficient data and enough research going on in the area. So this is something that has to be explored further from our end. And finally, the incorporation of new teleoncology models is something that we have to explore. And some of the possible models that were discovered during the narrative review that we conducted have been listed here. So we'll get started with the ROSE or ROSE technique, which stands for Rapid On-Site Evaluation. So this is a recent method of telemedicine that allows for increased interdisciplinary approaches to health. And essentially, in this photo, you can see how this ROSE technique is conducted in terms of uploading digitally scanned images of glass slides of stained body tissues in order to get those secondary opinions from other healthcare workers in terms of the diagnosis. And this technique on a global level has shown to lead to significant financial savings, both globally and also in a Canadian context. So, for example, a study in 2016 in Alberta showed that, in terms of per hospital care unit savings, the ROSE technique actually led to a saving of $100,000 on a per unit basis, which is huge. Another technique that was discovered was the Queensland remote chemotherapy supervision. And essentially, this is a technique where the nurse administers chemotherapy in small rural towns under the supervision of a health professional. So as you can see here, we have the nurse administering the service under the supervision of a healthcare worker. And this technique actually stems from Australia. So in an Australian context, it was actually, this technique was shown to lead to enhanced collaboration among clinicians and managers. And also it obviously led to increasing that availability of electronic medical records. In conclusion, teleoncology is a reasonable model for healthcare, for the future of healthcare, and in order to make sure that we are making that service more accessible, especially to our rural areas. However, at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that there are many limitations that we need to work through, and make sure that we are addressing them. Some of them have been underlying for many years since colonialism eras, and some of them are things that we could fix in terms of making more areas, more devices available for teleoncology in rural areas. And in terms of the models that we explored, the models that were explored in the previous slides, these are some of the things that could perhaps be explored more in a Canadian context, as they really help with enhancing that accessibility of services for everyone. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, either right now or through the Q&A chat that we have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Parmin. That was incredibly information rich and very specialized. So that was great. I got one direct message question for you. And then I also have one kind of my own too. So I'll ask the one I received here. They're wondering whether or not teleoncology will hurt rural communities in the long run because of the possibility that it will neglect to put up physical clinics in favor of telemedicine.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think that's where, we should really make an effort in terms of, really evaluating what could be, what could be actually replaced with teleoncology and what are some of the things that perhaps could not be fully replaced, but could be, altered to an extent with teleoncology. So obviously, for the more specialized diagnosis where, that in-person interaction is needed in order to see how everything is, because at the same time you also have to make sure that, or you also have to recognize that there are many psychological factors and a bunch of different stuff going on with conditions like cancer or any other illness. So again, I think it really comes down to how supportive the future healthcare providers, the current healthcare providers are in terms of actually exploring and actually conducting research in these areas to see, which types of teleoncology services could be replaced more, which ones still require that in-person aspect. And obviously, with the continued growth that we have in terms of technology in general, hopefully, we should be, overall, we should be moving towards a direction of making everything more accessible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's a lot of what ifs and how to do it best, hopefully thinking in ideal terms and getting to a strong result. The question that I had was less specific to your overarching research, but I had noticed that in Peter's and your presentations, you acknowledged the language barriers between access for telemedicine with people with language barriers, Indigenous, Asian speakers, anybody with a non-English first language. There's probably a few solutions in the works, but do you have any idea of your own solution or ones that you've seen that you would support most that would kind of help the getting to a solution for gaining access with language barriers? I mean, obviously, other than removing the pretty negative stigma that there is that people deal with, but other than that, do you feel that there's a viable solution in the works?
Thanks, Jess. That's a great question. So I think I personally think the most important aspect with addressing these barriers is to make sure that all of us are making an effort to make that systematic change and that change of mindset towards a direction that we also recognize all of these less represented communities as part of our own community. So for example, something that I see a lot in my own university is that, for example, we do read a land acknowledgement at the beginning of all of the events. Like all of this stuff are done, but they are usually looked at as just a check mark, so that okay, land acknowledgement read, check. But I think the way that we can work on enhancing that is to make sure that we actually truly understand this land acknowledgement. What is Haudenosaunee? What is Anishinaabeg? What are all of those areas? And what is the history that they have? So I think it really starts with a change of mindset amongst us and also amongst the people that run medical schools, run our healthcare system, and all of that. So I think we should all be collectively working towards, truly understanding the histories of these communities and really make an effort that, we're not only having the representation from these communities by, recruiting people from these communities, but also allowing them to, discuss all of the topics that we may not be necessarily aware of, and we need to have that drive and passion for actually learning more.
That's a really strong answer. Thank you so much, Parmin. I quite appreciate it. The open-mindedness is definitely something that everybody should be working on, especially when it comes to colloquial languages, right? Like English just doesn't sound the same no matter who you're talking to. So making sure that it's accessible to every form of language barriers is definitely important. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to speak to? Go ahead and unmute or drop in the Q&A panels. If you have questions for Peter as well, feel free to drop them in the text channel. Like I said, he'll get to them when he's available.
Yeah, I got something. So one of the problems that you saw with the increase in telemedicine was that there are limitations in regulations. Like one of the ones you had talked about is billing regulations and salaries for nurses. It seems like from what I gathered from what you said, is there doesn't seem to be consistency amongst how we're paying our nurses and doctors and how we're billing our patients. So my question for you is that in your mind, is this more of a symptom of something new coming up that will sort itself out, or is it something that needs to be like addressed officially? And if it does need to be addressed by like institutions, do you consider that more of a question of like enshrining these regulations in law, or is it something that the medical institutions need to set as their own standard regardless of the law?
That's a great question, Zach. Thank you. So I think obviously, many of these issues are arising because, we may not have had necessarily, telemedicine going on to the extent that it is going on right now. So, many of it is arising simply because it's a new area that is being explored. We have more and more physicians following this method. So obviously some of the issues were unknown till now. And because of that, I think it's important perhaps to, first of all, for the physicians themselves to, recognize and see these issues and really speak up about it. Because I personally feel like that, you should be, I guess, like being valued for the work that you put in. So I personally believe that it is important for these issues to be addressed, especially as you all know, healthcare workers really, they really sacrificed a lot for us over the past year with the pandemic going on. And I'm not just referring to doctors, nurses, even the hospital workers who like do all the cleaning and all that. So I believe, these are issues that perhaps will need to be addressed on an institutional level, just to make sure that we are, engaging with our medical community to the extent that we should be, and to the extent that they deserve it, because I believe this is a huge work to be at the forefront of taking care of a community's health. And as a result, I think these are issues that perhaps could be brought up at a community level and an institutional level in order to be addressed.
Thank you. I have another question too, if nobody else is about to ask one. And it was I don't know if you did answer this in the presentation, so just remind me if you did. But you had said one of the surprising and unintuitive results of your research was that patients often have a better reaction to bad news, which is counterintuitive to me. Because as you said, you'd think having the in-person support of another human being in front of you would be make it easier to receive the bad news. Do you have any reasoning as to why people are more comfortable with receiving bad news online rather than in person?
Thanks for the question, Zach. Yeah, this was actually something that when I saw it, I was also like, ooh, like that doesn't really make sense. What could be a reason behind it? What I personally anticipate could be one of the possible reasons is because obviously if you're joining an online appointment, you're probably joining it from your home or your workplace, so you're closer to family and friends in a sense. So I would say perhaps one possible reason is that you simply have that added support from family and friends who can accompany you during a hard time with such a diagnosis. And something else that I also anticipate as a possible reason is you've probably, or all of us have probably noticed it, but have you had that like that one incident where you are confident and what you're going to be doing, perhaps for like a test or an interview or whatever, and you get into this waiting room or whatever space with other people who are extremely stressed, and then you also kind of begin to feel stressed, and you kind of feel that you feel that loss of confidence, that like, oh, I think I should be stressed. So one possible aspect of it could also be, that domino effect that is not there in an online interactions, because you're not waiting in, the waiting room for an office. You're not seeing other patients who may be, not in the best mood. So I think another possible reason is that it's just your emotions only, and you may not be the person that reacts the most extreme to perhaps news like that. But yeah, that was definitely an interesting finding, because obviously in in-person interactions, there could be a lot more supportive acts that could be going on versus online. But those are some of the reasons that I'm guessing could be a possible explanation behind it.
Thank you. Nobody else is asking, so I've got one more that I just thought of when you're talking there. So you mentioned like that in-person support. On the one hand, it seems like it'd be helpful to have your friends and family around and other people who are going through similar things. But on the other hand, when you're in a room full of stressed people or people in bad moods or worried people, that rubs off on you. So then, is there a possibility of us opening up things that are like support groups that are online for these types of telemedicine, so that people who are confused by it, who need support after in their groups, is there some sort of like forums, mediums that are opening up with these clinics that could help? Or do you think they might have the same effect as the doctor's office, just an online version of making you more stressed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion for perhaps something that could be implemented in the future. I think I may have like a biased opinion, but I think something that is a bit different in like online interactions versus in-person interactions is that I think people are usually a bit more cautious in online interaction, in the sense that like if you put a post on like Facebook or whatever group, it kind of just stays there, versus if you just say something in an in-person interaction, people may not necessarily remember it exactly afterwards. So I think in that sense, like other patients and other people with a similar condition may be a bit more cautious about what they say. They may not be as, I guess, like as a negative as they might have been during an in-person interaction. But as you said, obviously that domino effect could or that rubbing off effect could definitely still be happening. So I think one way that could be managed is perhaps for these groups to be somehow moderated. Obviously, with that, many of the confidentiality issues would come up, that like who would be in charge of actually moderating something like that. But I think like having that online space for everyone to talk about their feelings, talk about how they're dealing with the scenario, is definitely a great way to make sure that that support is still there in a different format. And again, it really ties into the issue of making everything more accessible, right? So if someone is living in a rural area, then they may need that added support in an online format. But I think in terms of your original question, it could go in either direction. One thing I would say, though, is that I usually find that people are a bit more cautious in, what they post online or, what is written online from them through a platform compared to like more in-person interactions. Yeah, but that's just my opinion. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. That was a good, thorough answer. I'll stop grilling you with questions, though, if somebody else has something they can ask.
I wanted to add, too, it's kind of like, it's more of a speculative thought regarding your first question and like the idea of virtual versus in-person space. As somebody who's like grew up in a rural area, is introverted, and has dealt with some health issues, I found that like somebody also who has grown up in kind of a very virtual world to begin with, and obviously with the emphasis of it on COVID, but like growing up, I found that there is a lot of people who, when you enter the virtual world as a participant and somebody who's looking for connection, there's kind of almost like a safety net when you're talking to somebody, not in a huge group space, not something like Facebook, but when you are messaging somebody who you know virtually, rather than in person, there's almost like a safer feeling of like I'm in my own space. There's that phenomena of safe space. And then there's also that kind of like disconnect in a way where you don't have to like physically be in front of somebody. And so for some people who are like concerned about like their being overbearing or overwhelmed or too emotional with one particular presence who you wouldn't normally be as close with when you're in an in-person situation, feel like there's a little, it's kind of weird to explain, right? It's kind of a weird phenomena, but I feel like sometimes with some sorts of people, there is kind of like a safety net of being in your own space, controlling what happens, controlling when to end a conversation, kind of a thing. And so I feel like maybe part of that comes into it where you are just kind of like you're safe, you're in your home. If you choose to talk to somebody, family, friend, medical professional, or otherwise, that is very much like your autonomous decision. Whereas like sometimes when you enter a space like a doctor's office, you've got your witness, you've got your medical professional, and then all of a sudden you're kind of trapped. Like you're in this space where you can't leave, or you can't really like, you're not free to express yourself the way you would in your own home, kind of a thing. So I feel like maybe it has something to do with that. And again, this is very like personal bias and speculative. So there's no like no way of affirming or denying, but I feel like maybe there's something to do with that kind of phenomena of it. I don't know if you want to add anything, Parmin.
Yeah, that was actually a great example, and I personally, in my own personal opinion, also definitely agree with you that perhaps in an online context you have more autonomy and more control about how you want your interactions to go. And that is also one of the issues of online world from some people's opinion, that you're kind of hidden behind this avatar online that everyone else sees from you. So that is something that many people see as a challenge of online, that you don't really get to know the other person. You get to know the avatar of the other person in a sense. But obviously, these are issues that have to be explored. And again, a lot of subjectivity is involved in all of this. So, you just have to try finding a balance between the availability of these different resources and also seeing what works for which person. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very well said. I appreciate all the conversation we've gotten to have with you today, Parmin. If you have any final comments, feel free. If anybody